Hello. Today, we're going to continue our conversation about ancient Egypt, and particularly want to talk a little bit more about trade in ancient Egypt and just a few more things about the trade before. I know you just watched a couple of Ed puzzles on it, or one Ed puzzle. Anyway, we're also going to talk about the New Kingdom today. So, let's get started. Ancient Egypt was a country rich in many natural resources, but it still was not sufficient, and so it had to rely on trade for necessary goods and luxuries. Trade flourished through an exchange of goods and services based on a standard of value that both parties considered fair. So within Egypt itself, trade occurred with goods and services that were valued on a unit known as a daben. According to the one historian, the daben was approximately 90 grams of copper. It was about 90 grams of copper. That's what approximately means. And for the most part, an example would be if a scroll was equal to one daben and sandals were equal to one daben, then it's possible that you could, when you're in the system, take a pair of sandals and exchange them for a scroll. So that's kind of how things worked, if things were even. In the same way, if 3 jugs of beer cost a daben in a day's work, and one could fairly be paid 3 jugs of beer for one's daily labor. So, sorry, if 3 jugs of beer cost a daben on a day's work, and a day's work was worth 1 daben, then 3 jugs of beer could be given for one's daily labor. That was not uncommon. Mesopotamia was an early trade partner whose influence on the development of Egyptian art, religion, and culture. And this has been noted because we have found, using this pointer, we have found artifacts not only in Egypt but also Mesopotamia and vice versa. And it appears as though, since we know Mesopotamia seems to have come first, that there must have been some trade in order for them to have influence on Egypt, particularly wondering about, some historians wonder about writing. It seems clear that the early Mesopotamian culture, especially Sumeria, had a significant impact on the developing culture of Egypt. In any case, let's head on now to talk about the period of Egyptian history known as the New Kingdom. See, Ahmose was the ruler who, let's go back a little bit and talk about the Hyksos, because they ruled the region as far back as the 1500s. The Hyksos, before the 1500s, the Hyksos were ruled, and they had ruled for about 150 to 200 years. We talked about that in the last video that I made. But the Egyptians eventually fought back through a man named Ahmose from Thebes, and he declared himself king and then drove the Hyksos out of Egypt. So he then ruled all of Egypt. And when he came to power, it marked the beginning of Egypt's 18th dynasty. Something to keep in mind is that a dynasty means a line of hereditary rulers in a country. So Ahmose's 18th dynasty meant that his whole family began to rule, and it was the 18th family to rule, as far as we know, in ancient Egypt. Again, this took place around 1550 to 10,050 BC. And during this time, we considered the New Kingdom. And there were lots of conquests that made the pharaohs rich, and also trade. Together, the whole of Egypt became pretty wealthy, but particularly the pharaohs, as it was still believed that the pharaohs owned things. So Egypt's first target, and after battling the Hyksos, their leaders feared that there would be future invasions. So to prevent such invasions from occurring, they decided to take control of all the possible invasion routes into the kingdom. So in the process, these leaders turned Egypt into an amazing empire. Here's an example of some of the trade routes. And if you notice, Egypt had some oases. The oasis is where you can get water. So if you're traveling from one place around to another, and you're you're trading along with Egypt and then you want to head out, these are some of the routes you might take. There's also a route over here that you might take. So lots of routes to conquer and cover here. Egypt's first target was the homeland of Hyksos. After taking over that area, the army continued north and conquered Syria. If you can see, here's more of where they came, and they continue conquering. As you can see from the map here, Egypt took over the entire eastern shore of the Mediterranean and the kingdom of Cush, which is located down here, south of Egypt. By the 1400s BC, Egypt was the leading military power in the region. Its empire extended from the Euphrates River to southern Nubia, so from way over here, all the way down to Nubia. And they were pretty much in charge, large and in charge over here. Military conquest made Egypt rich. The kingdom is conquered regularly. The kingdoms that it conquered regularly sent treasures to their Egyptian conquerors. For example, the kingdom of Cush that we saw below, and Nubia, so to south of Egypt, they sent the pharaoh often annual payments of gold, leopard skin, and precious stones to the pharaoh. In addition, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Hittite kings sent expensive gifts to Egypt in an effort to maintain good relations as well, and they were from outside of Egypt. Conquest also brought Egyptian traders into contact with more distant lands. Egypt's trade expanded along with his empire. Let's look at some of that trade. Profitable trade routes or paths followed by traders developed. Many of the lands of Egypt took over. Also had valuable resources for trade, and one particular was right here. This was a pretty popular area in Sinai. You can't see it, but this is a trade route. And it was a peninsula, and they had large supplies of turquoise and copper here. So that was pretty impressive and important to Egypt. One ruler who worked to increase Egyptian trade was Queen Hatshepsut. She sent Egyptian traders south to trade with the kingdom of Punt on the Red Sea and north to trade with the people of Asia Minor and Greece. And before we go any further, let's talk a little bit about Queen Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was married to the pharaoh Thutmose II, who happened to be her half-brother. I know it's weird. He died young, leaving the throne to Thutmose III, who was his son by another woman. Because Thutmose III was still very young, though, Hatshepsut took over power. Many people did not think women should rule, but Hatshepsut dressed as a man and called herself king. After she died, her son, Thutmose III, took over, and he vandalized all the monuments she'd built. So let's learn about some of the things that she did. She sent Egyptian traders south to trade with the kingdom of Punt. I already talked about that. And later pharaohs used the money they gained from the trade to support the arts and architecture, building many of the monuments that I mentioned earlier. She's especially remembered for the many impressive monuments and temples built during her reign that, as we learned, her stepson later came along and destroyed some of. But the best known of these structures was a magnificent temple built for her near the city of Thebes. Well, despite its great success, Egypt's military might did not go unchallenged. In the 1200 BCs, the pharaoh Ramses II, also known as the Great Ramses, fought the Hittites, a group from Asia Minor, which were up here, the Hittites. The two powers fought fiercely for years, but neither could manage to defeat each other. They were kind of always at a stalemate. Egypt faced threats in other parts of the empire as well. To the west, people known as the Tenu invaded the Nile Delta, which was over here. Remember, it's a very fertile area, so it's a very rich area, also a great area to come in from the sea. So it was a popular area to attempt to be invaded. Ramses fought them off, though, and built a series of forts to strengthen the western frontier. This proved to be a wise decision because the Tenyu invaded again a century, which is 100 years later. Faced with Egypt's strengthened defenses, the Tenyu were defeated, however, once again. Soon after Ramses the Great died, invaders called the Sea People sailed into the southwest of Asia. A little is known about these people. Historians are not even sure who they were. All we know is that they were strong warriors who had crushed the Hittites and destroyed the cities in southwest Asia. Only after 50 years of fighting back, the Egyptians were able to turn them back. Egypt survived, but its empire in Asia was gone. All this area was gone. Shortly after the invasions of the Hittites and the Sea Peoples, the new kingdom came to an end.